Mr. Speaker, when I was thinking about how to present this bill, it's a bill that's been tabled 4 times, but this is the second reading. And I want to thank also my associates in the other parties. I want to thank Yasser Naqvi from Ottawa Centre. I want to thank Christine Elliott from Whitby, Oshawa. Brave folk both for signing on to this and for supporting this cause. So thank you both. And I thought about how I could present it, and I could start by talking about, and I will, the situation that most trans folk find themselves in. There was a huge study done in the United States. There hasn't been one presented in Canada with the same kind of numbers. This included about 7,000 trans folk in the United States. They discovered in that study that 41% had attempted suicide. That's about 25 times the normal rate of attempted suicide. They also discovered that almost 1 in 2 trans folk lived in poverty. Again, way, way higher than the general population. They discovered that the vast majority of trans folk are bullied in school, and it's interesting, we're talking about Bill 1314 in committee now, and I have to say there's been huge media influence and excitement about that bill, and so there should be. And certainly we in the New Democratic Party would like to see GSAs be allowed in schools. I'll say it right up front. Thank you. But, you know, we had a press conference the other day around this issue, and no press showed up. That's what we're dealing with here, Mr. Speaker. We're dealing with a problem that often goes unrecognized. It goes unrecognized, unacknowledged, and has the results that I just told you about in this study. That's what happens to trans folk. I could talk about the legal aspects. I could talk about the recent Human Rights Tribunal action, which is groundbreaking, with XY, where XY won against the Ministry of Consumer Services, won a groundbreaking challenge, which was to say that you shouldn't have to go through a surgical procedure to be able to use identification that shows that you're a woman, even though you haven't had the transition surgery, or a man, vice versa. That this is actually anti the human rights of trans folk. And this is exactly the reason that we need explicit protection in the Human Rights Code. It has been argued that it's already implicit. But that's not what Barbara Hall says, who, when I first tabled this years ago, wrote a letter to the Toronto Star in support of explicit wording, gender identity and gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code. I could talk about the federal instance, where we know that trans folk have been stopped from boarding planes. Human Rights Watch in the United States said, if you're a trans person, don't try to fly in Canada. I mean, come on, this is an embarrassment on an international scale. Why? Because very quietly, in 2010, the then Minister of Transport federally brought in a regulation that said that you gotta match the presenting ID in the minds, of course, of the people checking. Again, this is an incredible deterrent for trans people just to travel. Certainly federally, there's a bill before the House federally for the second time to look at adding gender identity and gender expression federally for that very reason. We all know about Jenna. Jenna, the trans person, the woman who wanted to enter the Miss Universe contest and was denied that. It made a lot of international press. Donald Trump, absolutely. And again, he was forced to backtrack on that. Thankfully. But again, another very, very obvious instance of transphobia. It's real, it's everywhere, it's here in Ontario, it's across Canada, and it's international. That's the reality of transphobia. I could talk about the trans lobby efforts, because what an amazing group of people we have here, Mr. Speaker. Amazing group of brave individuals who have been at this for years. I might say decades, that they have been championing this without a great deal of support. I might also talk about some of the people at Parkdale Activity and Recreation Centre who have been champions of all of those who suffer oppression in my area of Parkdale, and who have also championed the cause of trans folk as well. So I welcome you here too. It's wonderful to see you. I could talk about where it's better in the world, and it is better in other jurisdictions. Northwest Territories has gender identity in their human rights code. We know it can be done in Canada. The entire European Economic Union recognizes gender identity as a way of discriminating against people. So we're a little behind here, but we can catch up. And I think today, I'm hopeful today, Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what we're going to do. But I could speak about all those things, but what I really want to talk about is a person, Toby Dancer, because this is known as Toby's Act. And let me tell you about Toby. Toby died about 8 years ago. And Toby first walked into my church looking like a man. Turned out Toby was a woman. Looking First Nations. Turned out Toby was of Ukrainian heritage. Looking like a drifter. Turned out Toby was one of the most accomplished musicians in Canada. Had actually produced Ian Tyson albums, played the piano for us, and we were blown away when we heard her play. Phenomenal jazz musician, and eventually became the music director of my church. And Toby also started a gospel choir for us, as well as being the music director over at Parkdale Activity and Recreation Centre. And I'm seeing nods because some of the fellow musicians to Toby are here. Toby changed lives. Toby changed lives. And Toby, like many trans folk, also suffered from depression, also suffered from addiction issues, and Toby eventually died from those issues. And at Toby's funeral, I said, we may be the first church, and let me backtrack a little bit, because this is what we did in our church, to put a stained glass window in the sanctuary depicting a trans person, because we had one made of Toby playing the piano, and it's up at Emmanuel Howard Park United Church on Roncesvalles as we speak. And I said that. I said, we may be the first church to have done that. And somebody called out, what about Joan of Arc? And they're right. They're right. They're right, Mr. Speaker. What about Joan of Arc? What about those trans people in history that already have stained glass windows of them? So Toby may be not the first, but we're very, very proud of that window in that church. It's been the site of many filmings and photographs, and will be there forever, and will commemorate a very, very special person. I want to talk about Toby because Toby changed the lives of everyone who knew her. And we all came to know trans issues in our church through Toby. And that same church became the site of the first ordained trans person in Canada. Yes, absolutely, Cindy Bourgeois, who again, when she first walked into our church, walked in as a man and walked out as a woman, an ordained woman in the United Church of Canada, and is now in Stratford. So if you go to Stratford, go see Cindy preach. So that church became a center of a wonderful movement around trans folk and around combating transphobia, just by our very example. Toby also was a subject in part of a book that I wrote, and that book went on after Toby's death, unfortunately, because I really wished she could have been with me in Washington to receive the Lambda Award for that book for spirituality and religion. And it was based again on what we had done to be an inclusive church. It's called Queering Religion, Queering Evangelism. And it, in light of the great production of Bill 1314 and all of the deputations we heard, particularly pertinent, because the argument of that book was you can grow a church, you can grow an inclusive community by being inclusive and still being Christian. So I want that on the record, Mr. Speaker. You can be inclusive, you can still be Christian, and we did it, we proved it, we grew that church. We got that church to survive. And Toby was a part of that, and part of the book is dedicated to Toby. And now I can use her real name in the book. She's called Mary. So that was dedicated to her and to others who have died in our midst. So I'm going to have more to say on this and more to say on the whole issue of adding gender identity and gender expression to the Ontario Human Rights Code. But right now, I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to everyone who supported this. I want to say thank you to those who have shown up today, and not just today, but have shown up for years, for decades, some of them. I want to thank you to my colleagues from across the aisle and next to me, Progressive Conservative and Liberal parties, for also adding to this bill and adding their support for it. Because if there's one thing I know, and there's one thing I really want to see, it's that at this Pride, this year, that we march in a Pride parade in a province where gender identity and gender expression has been added to the Ontario Human Rights Code, and where we celebrate it at Pride. So that's what I'm looking forward to. So I'm going to leave some time for my colleagues, and I look forward to talking more about Toby, more about trans issues, more about inclusivity, in fact, and what it means to be an inclusive society a little later. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.